I kind of think this is kind of a really pretty good capstone to your day because, you know, your hosts are the Center for Inclusive Democracy, and I think making democracy more inclusive, it really is at the heart of the quest to better understand diverse voters and diverse communities through the data related to those who can vote and those who do vote. So I figured as a way to get to an opening question for this group, I would argue that the stakes, honestly, to me, have never been as high as they are now for good data. Because if you think about it, there are all of these desires for us to be a more inclusive democracy. We talk about it so often, and yet we look at some of the data challenges you have to make that real. And I think it's kind of the world that these folks live in, especially when it comes to California's electorate. So let me start with something that's going to reveal whether these folks are optimists or pessimists by heart. This will be fun, right? I want them to, I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm going to start, well, no, that's no fun. I know where Paul's going to be, so I'm going to let him be the person he's going to be. So we'll start there in Karin, you get to be second, then we'll go to these smart gentlemen on the other side. I want you to tell me, as a political data nerd, since we've established that as the panel, give us something that you think is improving these days in our understanding of our diverse electorate, or the thing that you think is really still setting us back, holding us back. So are you an optimist, things are getting better, or are you a pessimist, man, we're still struggling where we need to be on this topic? Paul Mitchell, go.
I'm a super optimist. I'd say the number one thing in the time that I've worked in elections at PDI in particular has been the improved voter registration system. I talk to reporters all around the country, and I basically tell them that you want to look at how somebody gets a ballot, or how somebody gets registered, how somebody stays registered, how somebody gets a ballot, how they return the ballot. And of course, after that, it's how the ballot's processed. But those first four things are really critical for being able to evaluate an election system and how close we can get our election system to be reflective of the actual population. Because the real crisis in our democracy, aside from the new crises, but one of the real crises in our democracy is that the voters that will vote, particularly in the low turnout election, are not representative of the broad state. And the one way I used to characterize it was that the voters in any given election, say the 2020 or 2018 gubernatorial election cycle, if you were to look at the composition of those voters, what percentage of them is Latino as an example, you would be looking at an electorate that looks just like California did 30 years ago. So you'd look at this electorate, you'd be like, ooh, look, it's 19% Latino. When was California 19% Latino? Decades ago. And so it takes decades to kind of get to where we are today. Like the diversity of today will be reflected in who's voting in 18, 20 years. It's crazy.
Is that optimism or pessimism?
The changes in the election system have done a lot to bring us closer to better representation of the true California composition, because we are registering more voters. We went from 17-ish, 18-ish million every election cycle to up to 22 by getting more young people registered, getting young people to stay registered. We did analysis looking at young people from 18 to 29. In that decade, they would move 4 times in that decade, they'd move 4 times, which meant they'd move every election cycle. For Latinos, they'd move 5 times on average in that decade. And what happens when you move? Do you not have to pay taxes that year? You do. Does your driver's license go away? No, it doesn't. Does your voter registration get kind of disappeared? Yes. Until we created the NCOA registration. So not only do we have people when they move, they stay registered more often, but also means that part of the voter file is much cleaner. If you looked at the 18 to 29-year-old voter file in Kern County in 2012, it was garbage. Like, it was not good and not getting properly updated. The ballots weren't being sent to the right households. The voter guides weren't being sent to the right households. People weren't in the right precincts. So that's been improved. So I'd say I'm an optimist because in the time that I've been working on it, the quality of the voter file is so improved, the ability to vote is so much improved, the ability to have access to the right voting material and know how to return your ballot and all that stuff is just so improved in all those measures.
So you get to follow him, Karin. Is the story one of improvements or still challenges when we look at this topic?
Well, I am
You can be a pessimist.
redistricting person, I wanted to say.
Yes, we'll go ahead in that point.
So I'm a redistricting person, so I'm going to look at the good and the bad from that perspective. Redistricting, of course, voting rights, very closely related, and I also sometimes work on figuring out ballot access issues. So on the positive note, I am very encouraged that we got some changes made to the Fair Maps Act. I mean, we have the Fair Maps Act now. Those of you who don't know that, it's, addresses kind of local redistricting, kind of looks at the criteria and outreach and posting requirements and all of that good stuff that the State Redistricting Commission had to do, and then kind of mandates that on the local level. It's been broadened, so now it's cities, counties, and special districts that have to implement certain mechanisms, and that brings more people into this space, which is really great because it allows people to communicate better with the local legislators. So that kind of thing I really, really like. Not so great, census data. I am very pessimistic about what's going on with the census. Having looked at the last round of census data, for those of you who have better things to do, I hope you all do, like on the weekend in particular, it's good things on Netflix and all that, but those of you who don't like Netflix, there is a disclosure avoidance system that they implemented in 2018 that wrecked our data, and they're kind of digging in on that, so we're not getting data back from census that people on the ground look at. When they look at it, they don't see their communities reflected in the data that they're getting back. So what we call ground truth has kind of gone up in flames, and that is really disappointing. So that would be my negative.
That's fair. All right, Matt Barreto, I'm going to frame it to you this way, the way we do polling. Right direction or wrong direction?
Oh, boy. So I'll put my polling hat on. First, I want to thank Mindy and the USC Center for inviting me here, the UCLA Bruin. It pains me a little bit to be at the USC event. That is such a nice event today. But if you don't know, Mindy is a UC alum, and so she is part of the UC system, and so we can
Aggie.
Though we can bond over that still. Anyway, so thanks for putting this on, Mindy. I'm going to say two things. I'll talk about the voter file also and multiracial democracy. But in terms of polling and putting my polling hat on, there has been dramatic changes that I think I'm mostly pessimistic about when it comes to public polling. I'm quite optimistic about in terms of internal polling that professional pollsters are doing for campaigns, which is part of what I do. There's so much variety in terms of the polling that's out there. And part of what it gets wrong is the diversity of the California electorate. And Paul and I were talking about this earlier in the lunchroom. And so as consumers of polls, you have to be extremely wary of the data that you're seeing and ask, how did they get the sample? Who's in the sample? Is it reflective of our community? Probably it's not. And for those of us who lived through the polling in the 16 campaign, I was on the Clinton campaign in 16, there have been good changes done to internal, like professional scientific pollster polling because of what we learned in 16 and the people that we got wrong and left out in there. And so I think when you're looking at what the candidates are doing, what places like the DCCC is doing probably in monitoring these elections in California, that polling is probably fairly accurate. And I think the same thing we saw in 22, there was a lot of forecast of a huge Republican surge in 22 that didn't end up coming because of some of that polling. So it's very difficult. I think it makes the New York Times job harder, Real Clear Politics harder, Nate Silver's job's harder, Nate Cohn's job harder to try to aggregate these polls because half of them, maybe more than half of them, are just terrible. So that's my pessimism. On the voter file, I'll say quickly, I'm quite optimistic about going to the title of the panel, multiracial democracy and inclusiveness in understanding. We have two really important advancements. One is that California is now asking for your race and ethnicity when you register to vote. We have about 30%, maybe about a third, a little bit under a third, I don't know the exact number right now, of our 22 million or however many million we have, Paul, on the file, who have self-reported their race and ethnicity. So we can use that as an anchor to then use Bayesian improved surname geocoding, which does two things that we've been doing forever, which is take census data on the neighborhood you live in. That's the geocoding part, and to take your surname, which we've been doing, and Karin's shop has been reporting Asian and Latino surname data by precinct for the whole state of California for 20 years by block, which then can get matched to precinct. But for a long time, we've had that surname data, and it's quite good and reliable. But if we also use the census data, which we've had since forever, and merge those together, we've been able to, in our work with the Secretary of State, use the VoteCal data as an anchor when someone tells us their race and ethnicity, and then use this methodology to predict it, check and compare, and Mindy and Eric and I have had discussions about this, check and compare it to the actual real answer on the file, and then use it for out-of-sample prediction. And so we think that there's much more understanding, I think, of diverse communities today. In California, you can do it not just for Asian and Latino, but for African American and white as well, and get highly accurate understanding at the community level of what's happening. And hopefully that's something that then our county executives can use to understand their communities better.
Some of this I want to come back to in a moment, because I think it's a really good topic to drill down on. Eric, so when we talk about reliable data, inclusive data, we on a good path, or you feeling pessimistic and you want to bring us down at the end of this question?
You made mine so much more complicated. He got right direction, wrong direction.
I know. Right?
So I would say probably on balance, I'm an optimist, right direction person, because I think California was relatively late to have a statewide voter file. It got delayed a long time. When that statewide voter file went online, it enabled a lot of reforms that had been kind of backed up prior to that point. So that piece of it is a reason to be optimistic. There are great new techniques that are being used to identify the race ethnicity of voters on the file. They work pretty well. I've used it in my own work. It's opened a lot of windows onto inequities and challenges that we have in California. I guess I would say I think there's more, and we can maybe get into this later on the panel. I think there's more that can be done on the self-reported side, because the self-report question for the voter file, it's only available on the online registration portal. It's not available through the automatic voter registration system, which is where a huge amount of the registrations are coming now. And so we should kind of anticipate that over time we're going to see that number of people on the file who are self-reporting gradually kind of decline again. And so I think there's things that we can do to try and boost those numbers. And again, we can talk about that.
Let's talk about that right now.
Yeah.
Because it's like you read my notes, Eric. Because what I was going to ask is that when I look at like how we do compared to other states or best practices or things out there, we always think we're America's coming attraction, as Governor Newsom likes to call it. We're always doing stuff before everybody else. There are places that are doing better than we are. Mindy, some of the report work that you've done show this. Like, I think some of your notes, like response rates, Georgia high, California not high. Like, I mean, where could we learn something? So I'm trying to kind of transition out of what Eric was talking about. I think it's a good topic.
Most states do not require people to volunteer. Don't require that people are given the option to volunteer their race or ethnicity. And then with Georgia's a Voting Rights Act state, so there's a history of actually requiring that information to be given, period, right? So race and ethnicity data was collected. So that's why there's such a big difference between us and Georgia. So we're one of the states that asked people to volunteer their race ethnicity. We made a policy choice quite a long time ago to want to collect that information. But we're inconsistent when it comes to AVR, automatic voter registration. So we collect it through the old-fashioned paper form, right? We collect it when you register, if you register through OVR, online voter registration. It's very different. It's a simple drop-down, easy menu. You could maybe debate the categories that are given, but it's an easy menu. In the paper form, you have to fill in the box, degree variation. But in AVR, which is now the overwhelming, or at least the majority of our new registrants since AVR came into existence, that's how people are registering. We don't collect that information at all. And as best that we can tell, we don't see that there was a policy decision made around that. Everybody involved in the policy choice of AVR and then the implementation of AVR, no one really talked about, why, about collecting or asking that voluntary question around self-reported race of this. Does that make sense? So I think we're just inconsistent in terms of our application around that question.
Is that low-hanging fruit, though, Mindy? Is that something that we could, or any of you? A lot of my questions are going to go to anybody who wants to take a whack at it. But, there's something that strikes me as that would be relatively easy to deal with.
Well, full disclosure, Eric and I and a couple other academics, 3 years ago, we wrote an op-ed about this just because we had taken a deep dive. Annie actually led this work, breaking out the voter file to understand kind of the current state of the self-report picture, what percentage. And it's about 28-29% of the overall file where somebody has voluntarily given their race or ethnicity. But when you break it out, the number is sky high. It's almost at 80% if you register through OVR. 80% of OVR registrants, this is at least as of a couple of years ago, right, were giving this information. It's paltry, if I back to it as it always has been when it's paper. And then DMV, right, the vast majority of DMV, because we don't actually ask that question. So we've thought of it as a low-hanging fruit. I think we're careful in the op-ed that, Eric and I both, and the other academics, Mike Alvarez and a colleague at UC San Diego, we don't take policy positions generally on things like this. But what we suggested in the op-ed was that people just have a conversation. That the data was so striking that if that information was collected, still voluntary, but if that information was collected through AVR, lots of conversations about what the question or questions will, what that should look like, right? But if the information was collected, surely if it was anywhere close to the OVR percentages, we'd be pretty high. And it may change the conversation around imputation, what I was talking about earlier, right? Because when you're statistically guessing, there's no magic bullet there, right? There is error, right? And more so than others for smaller populations in our state where the geocoding rate isn't as helpful. So, but if you get self-reported, not that self-report is actually perfect, there can be error there too. We could be looking at a very different picture. We could have an overwhelming proportion to some number potentially. So we think California should just talk about it. So that's the opportunity part in this.
Well, and I was going to say that. So what we've heard back from the DMV on this, is that I will say the DMV never.
You mean the DMV actually responded to you? You don't
well,
wait
we were
in a line.
So we were in a
couldn't help myself.
The task force, yeah. And so we had them. They were captured, right?
You took a number away.
They had
invited us.
Right, but they were there, and
you
so
made them take a number away.
Yeah, normally they wouldn't necessarily respond, but so the DMV doesn't. In my experience, and we're just trying to be very candid here, doesn't generally like to add new things on its plate. It tends to put in the voter space, probably maybe in general, but they definitely see their mission as prioritizing the driver's license stuff, and the voter stuff is very secondary to them. So they're very resistant.
Changes just cumbersome also in their process.
Yeah, when AVR was passed, it took years of advocacy pressure to get the DMV to actually move, and in the end, they've pretty much implemented AVR because the governor stepped in and brought in his own computer geeks to sort of make it happen, right? But their message so that's kind of the context, and then their message that they're giving about this idea is, well, we can't do that because the DMV driver's license process has to be reasonably confidential, and when we ask people questions on the touchscreen form, then we have to confirm those questions with them later, and we don't want to have to try and make somebody confirm their race or ethnicity. So that's the answer that they give. So they're already starting to give kind of process-based resistance, and then it's not clear like who is interested in putting the extra pressure to push through that, right?
Matt, you were going to
answer? Yeah, I would say just from an actual advocacy perspective, which helps us as policy analysts and voting rights scholars, I would push the state of California to not just have a conversation, but to collect this data. I would say you should be collecting this data. We use this data all the time in these Section 5 states that Mindy was talking about, Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, to enforce voting rights. We can know whether or not Black folks are getting their absentee ballots rejected higher if we know that those are Black folks on the voter file. If we don't know that, then we can't prove that. And so we need that data to be able to hold states and counties accountable for voting rights. It's exceptionally useful in all of those old Section 5 southern states to have race on the voter file. And California can do it. And I think Eric is exactly right about why the DMV doesn't want to do it, but it doesn't mean our state legislature can't say, well, you're going to collect it, and that can be a hidden variable. You don't have to confirm that. Just let the person have a little drop down and click their race, and just whatever they put is their own business. So I think it's certainly doable, and it would be immensely useful for us to understand our democracy and to make sure that it's equitable and that we can enforce voting rights.
And I just want to stay with this with you too, because I mean, if we did, I mean, here we are, we've all created our own legislation today, so if you want to submit that to the person down the street. But if we were to collect it, how would it change the work we do decennially on every decade on redistricting? How would it make it better? How would it not? How would it change, or how would it actually pull apart the need for all these other modeling topics if in fact you had more reliable data? I mean, I don't want to say that it's like, you know, the silver bullet of the conversation, but like, were we to do it, what kinds of things would you see differently? Karin, could you start, and then I'll go to Paul?
So I'm going to tie the answer into where I started. I feel like we need to start collecting better data in California because we cannot rely on a lot of data that we're getting from outside of California. So if we really want to know what our electorate looks like, then we have to just do better. And I like, Eric's suggestions and Mindy's suggestions, and you guys have, been on the forefront of kind of honking the horn on this, and I appreciate that you are really careful and you don't want to, push for it too much because it just is what it is, But I also think it's a really good idea. For us at Stay by Database, we're in a kind of unique spot here. I mean, if I'd say everybody who has ever used Stay by Database data, raise your hand. This entire row here for sure is going to raise their hand a lot and wave. And we give data away for free, right? So our data set basically, so we're not on the research angle, on the outward facing research angle. We don't really write a lot of papers, even though I have written some papers, but we give raw data away, essentially, processed data. And then people use the data to do research. And our data are longitudinal. So basically over time, you can go back to the 90s. So for us, we make changes incrementally. We do a lot of internal research before we change anything because nobody wants to go to Stay by Database and all of a sudden everything from the 90s has changed. So all those nice data sets that you had, everything's changed because there's a new methodology there. Yippee, we're going to try it, right? So for us, if we had better data in the voter file, we could do better research. We could have better conversations about whether we can include some of those variables that Matt was talking about. I mean, everybody's using WRU, everybody's looking at what can we do with it? Are these data solid enough? Are the results solid enough? For us, again, we have a responsibility because Stay by Database is a mandated data set that everybody has to use for redistricting purposes. So that means for implementation of the California Voting Rights Act, right? Fair Maps Act stuff, all of that, that's all on us, right? Everybody comes to Stay by Database, it's free, it's accessible 24/7, and it's debugged because everybody's constantly using it and letting us know, hey, we just found an error here, blah, blah, blah. We have a conversation, we go back to the counties, we go back to the SOS, there might be something wrong. We're debugging each other's files that way, So it's kind of a unique position here. But if we get more data, such as this self-reported data, then we can potentially do more. Right. And once we feel at Stay by Database that we can do a good job, we'll have the conversation to put it out publicly.
It does sound, though, just really quickly, it does sound as though you are reminding us that it's not just the data, it's the analysis of the data, it's methodology. There's more that has to come from there. I was going to go to Paul, but did you
Absolutely.
have something?
I'm glad we're talking about this today. I did not know we talk about it this much as this great, but at the same time, it isn't just a silver bullet. And I just want to stress the reason why we're being cautious is we're not partisan researchers, we're careful, period. But I recognize, and maybe I'll say for myself, and Eric can chime in too, but recognize that there are some very important conversations and decisions that have to be made about what that, if it is a drop-down menu, right, on ADR, how the question or questions are worded, what are the categories that people are given, right, that can make real differences in, this information for these groups are collected, but not these groups are collected, right? So it's not something that we think should be pushed, right? But rather, hopefully, what we're trying to do through op-eds and speaking to the SOS task force, which is staffed and those that participate are advocates and others, voting rights groups in California, is that we want everyone to consider what is right for them from their position, to be educated about the data, right? And these differences that we found, and then have conversations about what the right fix is. If it is this pathway, then the nuance of it is very important, right? And groups will.
Let me ask a quick follow-up though.
Potentially debate that.
Isn't the race already on the OVR as mandated by the state of California?
Yes.
So why couldn't they just take what they've already agreed to collect and do it at the DMV?
We have suggested that would be one path.
Yeah.
That would be the best path.
They've already signed off on it. It's on the online form.
Consistency of data collection, that makes a lot of sense. But
We're writing legislation here today.
And it would put it, maybe align the question more with the changes the census is making to
Yeah.
the way that race and ethnicity is being asked, right?
So
yeah.
we have talked about that.
Yeah.
But again, I think there's a conversation.
How would these changes impact what you see in the world?
So I'll back up a little bit first. People have used PDI. We have ethnicity on the PDI voter file. The state of California hasn't had a voter file, didn't have a statewide voter file until a few years ago. We've had one for 35 years. One of the things we do at PDI is we put ethnicity on the voter file using 3 variables mainly. Surname database. We use a census surname database, and literally Jim Hayes, who used to be the owner of PDI, used to read obituaries, and he'd find surnames, and he'd be like, aha, and he'd identify it. It literally had his own little cheat sheet of ethnicities. So surnames, birthplace, because that's on the voter file, and language ballot request accessing language ballots. If somebody's requested a Spanish language ballot, they're probably not like my brother who did it just for fun because he wanted to learn Spanish, but it's, they really were Spanish speakers. And we append that. Then there's also some stuff we do that is kind of like the Bayesian thing, like if you're live in a precinct that is, or live in a census block group that is 80% Latino and 20% black, and you're not Latino and you have a name like Paul Mitchell, you're going to be flagged as being black. So there's things like that, and there's also other things with like Filipinos versus Latinos, and there's other stuff that we do, but the primary components are those 3 pieces. Now, one other thing we do is that when Paul Mitchell's registered to vote in LA County and then moves to Yolo County and then moves to Sacramento County, every time I register, that county treats me as like a new voter, like, woo, I found this new voter. And I got no information. PDI, we have an archived file of over 200 million voter registrations, going back decades. And it's every time I've been when I was living in Orange County, when I was living in LA County, when I was living in Yolo County, and now in Sacramento County, all those registrations sit in that archive. And so when I move again, and I move to Placer County and go live on a ranch somewhere, they're going to put me in the PDI voter file and say, aha, there's this new voter, Paul Mitchell. And with my birth date and my other information, they're going to find my Sacramento registration and append my vote history, my YOLO registration and append my vote history, my LA and my Orange County. And if in Orange County I got a Vietnamese language ballot, we'll move that over too. So we can identify ethnicity based on past voter data as well as current voter data. And that's something the Secretary of State's office doesn't do. When I registered to vote online in Sacramento County and I put my ethnicity because I registered to vote online as Filipino. And then I moved to LA County and I'm at the DMV and they re-register, you know what happens? That Filipino flag disappears because now I'm newly registered at the DMV and I don't have that. We see that in the online voter registration, 80% of people are putting their ethnicity, but it's getting washed away when they go to the DMV and retouch the system in another county and they get re-registered. In our lifetimes as being registered voters, I would say most voters are going to interact with the online system at some point, re-registering to vote. And if the state had an ability to we call it cross-county appends, but if the state had the ability to manage that data better, you could deal with some of the leakage you're getting on that 28%. You could deal with that in a way that doesn't require you to fight with the DMV, because I think the DMV is going to fight hard to not have to ask people at the counter, what's your ethnicity? Can you say that louder? Kind of things that might be sensitive information.
I'm just curious, though, if I flip this to the other side, we've talked, since we've created our own legislation here, congratulations. In addition to creating a better system, there's also a voter education, voter awareness conversation with voters, with Californians about the importance of this information. And I'm just curious from any of you, I'm not sure which person to direct this to, are there places that we see the gaps more noticeable than others? Race, ethnicity gaps, particular communities? Are there places where our data is lacking the most?
Black voters.
So, okay, well, that's why I'm looking for someone else rather than me to validate what I mean, but is that...
Yeah, because, and this is true not just in California, this is just true nationally. You have surnames can be a really valuable tool for identifying ethnicity. We've actually looked at systems we might do which will look at people's historic voter records and find out who their parents are and figure out the surname of their parents to figure out that they are, or the ethnicity of their parents and that kind of stuff. There's stuff we can do on a lot of that. With Black voters, you don't have the cheat sheet of a language ballot request or a surname. And so you're going on lack of other ethnicity living in an area that is heavily Black, or that they used to live in an area that's heavily Black, and it's not perfect. And I hear frustration from people in that space that wish the data was better, but it just is not as easy to, when you see a Vietnamese voter on the voter file, it's a lot easier to identify them as being Vietnamese than identifying somebody as being Black.
I would say the census does have, they publish surname lists, dictionaries for every group, right? So everyone fills out the census, you write your name down on it, and then you check your race. And so the census republishes that back to us, and so we can get all of these names. Paul's right that they're not as commonly occurring as Wynn or Sanchez or Lee or something like that. But
we do first name African American. We do the first and middle names
and
now.
Last, and
we
you
do
should
first
use
and
all
middle.
those, first, middle, and last, but coupled with what you said, which is what WRU, BISG does, the census block that you live in. And when you do that and you compare it to the VoteCal data of people who have self-reported at blocks or precinct levels, it's extremely close.
Cue me on census data. Because this is kind of the problem, and this is why I started with census data, because we're all relying on census data to some extent to get these algorithms right. And as the census continues to implement this, in my opinion, really not very well fitting disclosure avoidance system called differential privacy, we're getting data that are just less and less accurate, in particular with respect to race and ethnicity. So our models are off because of that.
Aren't they mostly hiding that in places where there's like one Native American person in a
Nope.
block and they have to hide that? If it's a
Nope.
mixed race place, they're not doing nearly as much differential privacy.
Nope.
I would trust her on differential privacy for sure. But I do think that the areas that are 80% Black, which is where you're doing this stuff, it's different than like, they're gonna be really wrong on like, if they say that this census block group in Glendale is 4% Black, you cannot take that to the bank. That is ridiculous. But if they're saying it's 80% Black, it's going to be 80% Black because all the ones around it.
If I can, for the audience who knows part of what you're saying, present company included, are you saying, Karin, that that's a foundational concern?
Absolutely.
That with those problems, it could potentially bleed down into everything else we're talking about?
It does. And I think like sticking our fingers in our ears and going la 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 is not going to serve us well. And I know that you're working with somebody who disagrees with me,
Why?
and that's
Who's
all
that?
fine. Moon.
Who?
Moon.
I love Moon.
Yeah,
Are we
I
bringing Moon
know.
into the conversation?
And yeah,
I love Moon.
because Moon likes differential privacy and I don't. So anyway,
I will say
Cocktail
that
portion we're going to be having out there.
trust me on differential privacy, people.
So, trust on differential privacy, but I also think that I'm sorry. I was seeing Raul Macias.
What?
I was getting my nerds mixed up. What Matt is saying is right in that when we see people using, the BISG to figure out ethnicity, you really are looking at the census block groups that are heavily Black. But there are issues with that. If you look at your data, I'll bet you have former mayor of San Diego, Bob Filner, as being Black. I mean, he was in PDI for years because he was one of the, very, very, very few Black or white residents in a 80% Black part of San Diego. And there are it's always imperfect. And that's one of the things about this work. Nobody can ever say my data's perfect. It is messy. And part of the reason it's messy is because we're messy. My stepkids, Chris Hernandez and Brittany Robbins, I asked them both what they put on their census, and neither of them remembered. Both of them say, sometimes I put Latino, sometimes I put Chinese. Their mom is half Chinese, and their dad was raised Mexican, but found out decades later that they were actually Spanish. But literally, like, they didn't know, or they just said different things depending on the form.
Well, and the
so there's never
multiracial,
perfect.
multiracial is increasing over time, right?
Multiracial is crazy. I want to do multiracial flags on the voter file.
Some
Adding
complexity,
another
right?
layer of
Adds
complexity.
another layer of complexity to the whole
It turns
thing,
out that the multiracial has been artificially increasing because of census data coding, it turns out. So
Yeah, but I mean, it is actually increasing.
It is increasing,
also,
but
right?
not by, like, in
yeah,
some-
I mean, and the new question is going to address some of.
Can I ask a question here?
Are you guys still with us?
And by the way, I don't know if we ever made it completely clear, but differential privacy is where, in case for those of you who don't know, is where the census is just basically adding randomness to the data, so that when you get down to a small enough geographic unit, you can't identify anybody with any
We
high degree of
warned you
certainty.
this was the nerd panel, and we made good on it.
And can I say one the teacher in me just want to make sure that everybody knows we're focused so much on Black voter data. Again, we're not collecting data for so many different, right, racial and ethnic subpopulations. And the challenges are real, period. But the reason why we talk so much about Black voter data, and you've probably heard this in other places, is because it's the largest group in California, right, of voters of color that has these really significant challenges. So even though it's a large group, 1.7 million, remember, eligible voters I mentioned earlier today, the distribution of the Black population means that we have about, like, for instance, 45 out of 1,000 of census tracts in California, only 45 are majority Black. So the ability to be able to use geocoding is just very challenging to accurately identify somebody as Black versus white. And generally in research, we want to do no harm, and we want to make sure that we're, if the probability is at a certain level that we're comfortable with, then we're gonna, right. That's up to the researcher, right, in terms of their research questions and the appropriateness and where they want to kind of set that threshold in terms of their comfort level.
The reason, the thing that I wanted to get to, which links to all of this, because I mean, it goes back to this, okay, this is the world we live in, now what? Right? I mean, like, it's the now what, or what's next, or what do we do about it? First part of this, we wrote our own bill. Congratulations, we've got legislation pending. The governor's on the governor's desk.
He's going to veto it.
He's going to veto it. He did veto a bill that actually I wanted to talk about, but I'm not sure it fits here. It's a non sequitur for right now. But what I was going to say is, what is the part on educating voters about the importance of this? And why do we think, and the answer I know, I'm guessing, is going to be it depends. That's fine. But why do voters not want to offer up this information? And I know it's going to depend on the voter. In some cases, we've already gone through that we don't help them, right? They may not see it. It's harder to see in some places, online voting, DMV, et cetera. But is there reluctance in some communities to share this information? Is there a fear? Are there, right? We talk about immigration fears, right, in California, specifically with identifying information. One, are those kind of fears out there? Is that a valid thing? And two, what do we or what do groups do? How can we educate people in addition to change the system? And I would defer to anyone who wants to take a whack at that.
Well, I would say that first of all, I don't think there is much inherent reluctance to respond to the question, because it's all how the question is posed. So when it was in paper, nobody responded. When it went online and it was there as a drop-down menu, a whole bunch of people responded. And then, of course, when it's not on the form at all, at the DMV,
more than cultural.
Structural makes a bigger difference than anything else. But even when you have it on online voter registration, it's 80%. So there's clearly quite a number of people who don't want to respond to the question, and that should always be an option. I don't think we ever want to mandate that people answer this question if they don't feel like revealing it. But we could get, if we were at a place where 80% of the file had self-identified race, that would be huge, right? That would put us only a smidge behind places like like Georgia that had this long history of doing it.
So Matt, how often do poll respondents not put their ethnicity when you ask a poll?
We haven't found that, I mean, very few people don't want to tell us their ethnicity.
Yeah, they'll tell you that. That's my point. In polling, they always tell you their ethnicity, and it's like they're telling a random nobody. They don't even know who the hell is asking the question.
It's collected everywhere. I think it's ubiquitous. People are used to filling that out, and they feel the confidence.
Something people are afraid of doing.
I think if we could push it out more, that we could get the data, and to the education point, to help people understand that this will help us understand our communities better.
I also make the point that PDI doesn't get this data. We've gotten this data by counties just randomly sending it to us or sending it to us on accident, but structurally, we can't get counties to give us this data. And we can't get the state to give us this data.
Did you ask?
We've asked all the time.
And what's the answer you get?
We've had counties say, "Oh, we can't give you that data."
See, the reporter in me now is writing a story.
So
they said they can't give it.
If the researchers want to help us get this data from the state, we could make the targeting on the voter file stuff much more effective. We can use this to help build our ethnicities.
We can use it to anchor and see which ones you were correctly predicting, because 29% is already answered it, which is how all the
I just want to say for the Secretary of State, we don't get to give Paul data, okay? So just for the record, when you're getting data from the counties or from the Secretary of State, when you get the voter file, you have to fill out a form, they have to approve it, and then you don't get to just share it with a friend, even though we may want to share it with a friend, but so you should just talk to Jenna. Jenna likes you. Yeah.
I've left the group speechless there. Do you want to move to questions for a few minutes?
I think for time we should.
Yeah. I see. Wait, Karin's got something here.
Yeah.
Hang on just one moment. You're first.
And we were just
Public
talking about
service
Jana
announcement.
Lean, who is Chief of Elections for the Secretary of State's office, and she was on a panel earlier. And unfortunately, she forgot to mention a few voter outreach programs that the Secretary of State is doing, so I wanted to make sure that I get this in. The problem is that Jenna has really bad handwriting, so some of these may not be exactly how I'm reading them, so just be creative. So the Secretary of State is also doing voter education and outreach by the SOS, yes. The college ballot bowl, student mock election. There is an SOS Secretary of State town hall. Then there is a big social media push. And then there is a make a plan project that is connected to something else that I cannot read. So just wanted to make sure. Jana's your friend.
So use that information as you will.
They have a lot of programs on voter outreach.
Right.
So there you go.
You asked about the distribution of the vote over time, how many people vote early voting, and I think implied in there is there a difference by race ethnicity in terms of early vote on election day and so forth. I do, yes, and I do have this data in one of our recent reports that we released a couple of months ago on our website. So we had mapped out the distribution of the vote for the state by different groups.
But do you have it by different counties so that if, like I said,
Yes, we do. I remember what's in the appendix. There's a ton of county data in the appendix of that report, a ton. If we don't have exactly what you're looking for, just let us know and we can get it to you. Anybody, we answer any and all requests.
Yeah, and I mean, we have, I don't know, citizen voting age population is about the best you can get. We have it down to the block level. The problem is, again, I'm just going to be the pessimist on the census stuff, that the CVAP data do not correspond necessarily to the decennial or to the voter registration data. So you have to use it as an approximation, but it is available on the Stable Database site on the census block level, and I think it's helpful at least. It's not perfect.
I think the CVAP data is a good idea. You just have to remember it's 5-year average data. And so, so if you're looking at a certain year, you got to center it on the midpoint of those 5 years. But I think it's a good idea to take that data and maybe you could match it against the total number of registrants that they also have in their file and just find places where there's the biggest mismatch.
That's what we used to do.
It wouldn't be the exact number, but you might say, oh, look, this place has 10,000 eligible voters, but the voter file only shows 4,000 online there.
Yeah, I did a whole Tableau infographic for, was it ACLU? Yeah. That was like 10 years ago or something, right? But we did a whole thing where we took numbers of registered voters by census block or precinct or whatever it was, and the CVAP and subtracted it out to try to find the highest unregistered populations. And like you would expect, it was like, in this area, it'd be all around Sac State, you know, like places where you have a lot more transient populations and where young people were.
We were able to do that by race and ethnicity.
You could. The challenge is that you're really going to see how bad the CVAP is. Because you're going to do this thing where you're going to say, okay, we have, 14,000 voters here and 6,000 Latinos here, and CVAP says there's 3,000 Latinos. You're like, well, how can that be true?
Hence Matt's idea to try to kind of find some.
Yeah, it's messy. Just generally, matching different databases with different methodologies is always a mistake. And so it with lack of anything else to do, try it. But there are going to be oddities, and you just have to you have to go into it with eyes wide open. There's going to be noise.
And let me just say something that's going to horrify you. What they're going to do is, once they're starting to implement the new OMB categories, because the CVAP data set is a 5-year range data set, they're going to have different data collection, right, on the ACS also. So as you have that 5-year, they're actually going to go back to the years where they did not collect the data with the new categories, and they're going to start doing some acrobatics. And that's going to get really interesting, because we're going to have a mix and match in that ACS data set that's going to reflect onto the CVAP data. And now, are we geeky enough now?
You're geeky enough, but I got a couple of questions from online, so I want to make sure we get them.
I just found out this is like televised or something. I'm getting messages from people who aren't here.
Yeah, I told you it was a hot mic. I tried to tell you it was a hot mic. Okay, so the first question from one of the viewers online is, this person says, I'm curious as to how those who are mixed race can self-report more than one race. Is it an option on OVR and AVR to select more than one race?
I think there's just a mixed category.
Yeah, there's a mixed and an other.
Yeah.
And it gets a lot of people choose it.
Is that a limitation, though, of the process that we have to set in place?
And it's not going to get you the pure census question. It's just going to get you an approximation of it. And so the change in the census form, so people know, is that right now the way the census asks the race ethnicity question is it's 2 questions. So you have a question about whether you are of Hispanic origin, and then they have a question about what your race is, and that has over the years created all kinds of confusions, just in terms of analyzing the data, but then also for the people who are responding to the question. It turns out they get very confused, especially Latinos get very confused by, how do I manage this, and what do I put in the race side, because many Latinos consider their Hispanic heritage to be their race, and so they're confused, why are you asking me about my race? You just, what are these 2 questions? So they're going to put it all in one question, and you can just check all that apply. There are also some suggested groups that you would fall into each of these categories, and none of that is going to be, is on the online voter registration site, and will not be on anything that goes to the DMV for sure.
And nothing right now for AVR again.
Yeah, but it gets it closer, right? It's probably going to be in the same ballpark.
So then our second question feels as though it's a plant for Paul. How does PDI data compare with L2 voter data? A lot of researchers use L2, but I'm wondering why they aren't using PDI. Is there a cost and licensing issue?
Karin is giving her data away for free.
PDI
That's right. Come to Save Our Database.
PDI,
This really is the cocktail hour now. Go ahead.
So California is fortunate, and we are a high-quality voter data state. We have more data, better data, and PDI has been around for 35 years. We have all this longitudinal data. So PDI is great data. It is more expensive for a campaign to buy PDI data than to buy L2 data, but our data is going to be way more up to date. It's going to be higher quality, and campaigns are used to using that in California. If researchers need data, everyone on this table, have I given you data?
Oh, you've been great.
Okay,
No, he's great.
everybody on this table has gotten data from PDI, especially if you're doing research, or if it's ACLU, or if it's NALEO. We don't make our money on nonprofits or on researchers, so we are willing to work with researchers to make sure. Or journalists. You have a login still,
I used to have a login. I don't have a login anymore.
So researchers sometimes get this preconceived notion that PDI is this campaigns use it, it's more expensive, we're gonna go get something cheaper. And so they, will go get something from L2 or try to build it themselves. But I tell researchers, come to us. If you put at the bottom of your report, data provided by PDI, we'll basically give you the data for cost, and it's not an issue. And everybody in the academic world that's worked with us, I think, has been really happy with PDI data because it is higher quality.
I had to wear a T-shirt for a week, but anyway.
Yeah, and just to really say, I mean, and they tell you what the methodology is, which I really appreciate because there's a lot of like black boxes out there, okay? So it's not all the same.
All pro, Kim Alexander.
That's right. Thanks. Thanks, looked out. Some of the research I've done in the past shows that voters are reluctant to register to vote because they want to keep their personal information private. People may not want to turn over their ethnicity or race data or their phone numbers or other optional fields on the voter registration form with privacy concern. I just wonder, as researchers, what do you think about that as a barrier? Do you have any suggestions or ways government could take steps to provide more privacy protection for voters when they register?
I think phone is optional, right, on the California file. And certainly ethnicity, we've talked about 20% of folks don't do it. So we haven't encountered that barrier a lot. You know, people are so used to filling out forms in everything they do that there's definitely people who are concerned about it, but I would say it's far less than 5% of folks who are really concerned about that. There's so many things you fill out where you just, you know, on your phone, just put all that information in to get to the next screen or subscribe to something that I don't see it as a barrier. I do see your second part of the question of what can the government do to ensure privacy as being important. If the government is being entrusted with this data, they do need to take some protections on it. And so there could be, you know, better grounds, I think, for guaranteeing that and some of that information not, you know, falling into the wrong hands. But we all read about, you know, private company data breaches where hundreds of millions of pieces of our information are getting turned over on a daily basis.
Never
So-
from PDI. We have
Never from PDI.
Never had a data breach.
I appreciate being a part of this. I've learned a lot. This was the nerd panel. We've written legislation, we've drafted a campaign, and we're ready to tackle the census problems. So thank you, Mindy. Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks, panel.